So thanks also for organizing this whole lecture series, because climate and ethics has become obviously a very interesting field of research, generating some provocative ideas, but also because it's become very clear that climate and ethics is not merely an academic pursuit, that it's become actually fundamental to the negotiations, fundamental to the creation of a climate regime architecture that could actually solve this problem. And that was evident, perhaps first, in really clear terms in Bali. 1 year ago at the International Climate Negotiations, where the negotiations turned into a last-minute standoff. In fact, an after last minute. There was no consensus reached by the end of the negotiations. Negotiations overflowed from the end of the second week into a Saturday morning, and there was a standoff where the developing countries basically made very clear their demands that development, poverty alleviation, was not to be subordinated to the demands of climate change. And what that means is that the US was very concerned, because it was concerned about climate, but also concerned about the implications of fairness and equitable burden sharing for its own costs to itself in meeting climate obligations. And the US originally balked and said, we cannot support this consensus. And the negotiations were on the verge of collapse. There was a call to DC made, and there was a lot of pressure brought to bear by the G77, group of 77 developing countries in China, by the EU, by all the parties who were starting to very clearly understand that this reconciliation of development and climate was absolutely critical to the success of a climate regime. And in the end, the US did an about face, and a consensus was reached in Bali, and we now have this Bali Action Plan, which is the basis of the next 2 years of negotiations. In a couple of weeks in Poznan, Poland, and in another year in Copenhagen, by which point we hope to come up with the next stage of a climate regime that could actually take us onto the path of a fundamental transition. So when we did this work, and I would like now to acknowledge my co-authors, one of whom, Paul Baer, is in the audience, and supporters. When we did this work and issued this report in Bali, we kind of thought that, okay, this will be of interest to sort of the development-obsessed NGOs and other parts of civil society who are concerned about development and climate, and maybe they'll use it as kind of a benchmark of comparison to determine what could be a reasonable way of thinking about the climate regime in the context of development. But what has shocked us in this past year has been the amount of attention that this work has gotten, not just among civil society, but even among policymakers and delegates. We've had a lot of contact over the past year with not just negotiators from the developing countries, but also in the industrialized countries, with Europe in particular, and the delegations from Sweden and Norway, and some with the Netherlands and the UK, and especially the EU Parliament. We're now being asked to present and to brief, because people have realized that although our work has sort of gone out on a limb and is a bit of an outlier with respect to many of the other burden-sharing frameworks that are proposed, it actually seems to be one around which it might be possible to create a consensus. Now, I don't want to overstate, but there is a lot of promise here that has, and it's surprised us how much attention it's gotten. So that statement in Bali by developing countries that we need to see development very clearly integrated into a burden-sharing framework for climate was reiterated in. Sorry, I'm going to skip through the science. I think for this series we really don't need it. It was reiterated at the G5 summit, where the developing countries basically said, this is a high-level political declaration, said, Solving the climate problem is very important, but it needs to be done in the context of sustainable development, and it needs to be done in the context of accounting for historical responsibilities and national capabilities as the basis for a burden-sharing framework. So what we've done is try and take that and reconcile it with the climate problem. I'll skip through the science because I just want to make one point. The science since the fourth assessment report of the IPCC has only gotten more dramatic and more worrisome. And it has become clear that we really are facing a climate crisis that demands as its response something that is not at all short of basically an emergency response. We're not talking about something that is sort of an Apollo program or even a Marshall Plan. It really would resemble more closely a wartime mobilization, something that really demands significant resources of the global economies. So starting with that, I'd like to kind of take a step back and reframe and sort of present a framing for the whole problem, the whole climate problem. And this is a framing, sort of a thought experiment that has three parts. One is just a tiny bit of science. The second is a tiny bit of hopeful conjecture. And the third is some simple arithmetic. The science is embodied by this first curve, which is a global emissions trajectory over the first half of the century that would be more or less consistent with a 2-degree trajectory, a 2-degree path, stabilizing the warming at 2 degrees above pre-industrial. And there are two things to note about this. The first is that it's extremely ambitious. Emissions globally would peak in the next decade and then start to decline fairly radically, reaching a level 80% below 1990 emission levels by mid-century. The second thing to note about it is that even this is not a terribly reassuring trajectory. We're calling it a 2C trajectory, but it really still presents us with a 15 to 30% chance, roughly, of exceeding 2 degrees, and a non-trivial chance of exceeding even 3 degrees. This is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, would call a trajectory that is likely, but not very likely, to keep warming below 2 degrees. So that's the little bit of science. The second step is the hopeful conjecture that we in the North, the industrialized countries, what the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change calls the Annex I countries, that we would undertake our duty to radically reduce our emissions within the industrialized countries. This is a trajectory that shows emissions reducing by 90% relative to 1990 levels. This is beyond any of the targets that have been formally put on the table by any industrialized countries. It's consistent, actually, with what Al Gore has recommended for the U.S., 90% reduction by 2050. So extrapolating this across the rest of the Annex I countries, the industrialized countries, this blue line shows the portion of the global budget that would be consumed by the North. So the next step is just the simple arithmetic. What does that leave for the South? And that's the green line. And there are two things to notice about this as well. The first is that it, too, is extraordinarily ambitious. It would see southern emissions peaking by the end of the next decade as well, and then declining at a rate, roughly 6% per year, that's almost as fast as the rate at which global emissions would have to decline, and reaching a level that's about 70% below developing country 1990 emissions by mid-century. It's extraordinarily ambitious. And in fact, I had a long conversation with Rob over lunch about whether this is even technologically possible in the South. But that, thankfully, I had a long conversation with Bob Williams after lunch, where he was telling me about all the various technological options that would enable zero-carbon electricity, zero-carbon fuels, the availability of wind resources in all regions, and such. So the question that this cues up for us is what kind of a climate regime could enable this to happen? And by this, I really focus on this developing country pathway. In the North, in the wealthier countries, we have the resources, we have access to the technologies and the technological development capabilities to see this happening. And it's being put on the table by nominally credible people like former vice presidents. This is the real challenge. How can we see this happen? And in particular, the whole question, the complete question, is what kind of a climate regime could enable that to happen in the midst of an ongoing and equally, if not more severe, development crisis. And what I have up here is a list with which many of you are probably more or less familiar of fairly depressing poverty statistics about what poverty means in developing countries. And there is an entire story to be told about any one of these. But the only thing I'll point out is that overcoming any one of these dismal statistics, either directly or indirectly, requires the expansion of energy services. Directly in the case of, say, the 2 billion people who don't have access to clean cooking fuels, or even indirectly in the case of the people who, the children dying from diarrhea, or the people without access to fresh drinking water because of the need for energy services for distributing, purifying fresh drinking water and for sanitation. So the real question that's queued up is how can we solve this climate problem? How can we conceive of a burden-sharing framework in this world that requires such dramatic reductions in developing countries? How can we do this in a way that really ensures that these energy services can expand? So this is sort of the backdrop against which myself and my collaborators tried to sort of from the ground up create a climate architecture, a burden-sharing framework by which the development imperative could be reconciled with the need to respond to this climate crisis. And the demands that it puts on a climate regime are fairly simply and easily stated. First, a climate regime would have to ensure the rapid, in fact, dramatic mitigation required by an emergency climate stabilization program, truly a massive global mobilization. But then, as well, to support the deep and extensive adaptation that will also be needed. We've already seen about 0.7 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. There's something on the order of 0.8 degrees already in the pipeline based on current GHG concentrations. And so the combined 1.5 degrees itself implies significant climate impacts that would need major investments to build adaptive capacity, especially in poor countries and in poor communities, to deal with the inevitable impacts. But then those two, the mitigation and the adaptation, would need to be done while at the same time safeguarding a right to development, ensuring that the costs are borne in a way that allows developing countries to develop. The way that this was put by a noted Malaysian political analyst and economist named Martin Kaur is that the South is now facing a triple crisis. The first is the conventional development crisis that we all know all too well. The second is this climate crisis that threatens to undermine development gains that are finally being gradually made. And the third is what he called the climate policy crisis, the danger that a climate regime itself could impose burdens on the South and restrict access to energy services that would further undermine developmental gains. So it's in response to that triple crisis that we've tried to take the step of designing a climate regime. So this regime that we've put forward, which we term the Greenhouse Development Rights Burden-Sharing Framework, has a very simple sort of architectural framework. It involves first, sort of as a pre-step, defining and calculating national obligations with respect to what we're terming a development threshold, a level of welfare, a level of development to which all people should be equally entitled to strive. And then to allow those people with incomes and emissions below the threshold to simply prioritize development, to not be saddled with the costs of meeting climate constraints. And then third, to oblige those people with incomes and emissions above the threshold, whether in the North or in the South, to pay the global costs in an emergency climate program. This is the first place at which we start to part from sort of the common wisdom. in that, similar to the work that Rob has done with colleagues of his, Shorbel Chakravarti and Massimo Tavoni and Steve Pacala, we're looking within countries at the actual development and welfare status of people within countries, and I'll say much more about that. So let me get a little bit more specific, a little bit more quantitative about what this means and what its ramifications are. So first, what do I mean by this development threshold? What should a right to development within a climate regime attempt to safeguard? And are we talking about sort of the traditional poverty line of $1 a day or $2 a day, as is typically used by organizations that are focused on development like the World Bank or the UNDP? And I would say no, fairly emphatically no, that $1 a day, which actually was first defined in 1985 dollars, so actually means slightly more than that today, is really a destitution line, and $2 a day, an extreme poverty line. But you can look at this question empirically and ask, at what level of income do individuals start to attain sort of industrialized country levels of key development indicators like infant mortality, life expectancy, access to healthcare, access to education. And that empirical work has been done. And sort of careful country-by-country analyses and across time analyses suggest that if looked at empirically, a global poverty line could be defined at about $16 a day. Still not very much at all. This is done, this is work of Lant Pritchett at the World Bank and currently at the Kennedy School. So what we've done is we've taken this as a global poverty line and said, okay, let's take a small margin above that, say $25% above that, and define a development threshold for the purposes of our own indicative calculation at about $20 a day, or $7,500 per year. So this is not by any means meant to be the last word on what a right to development is, and we really think of this just as a starting point for a discussion about how a right to development could be defined and brought into a climate regime. But I think this is a very defensible starting point, and very useful and simple and explicit starting point for doing some indicative calculations. So what are the implications of this? Having defined this development threshold, how do we define burdens in terms of it? And we take the lead of the UNFCCC itself. We define national obligations, the national share of the global costs of mitigation and adaptation based on capacity, resources to pay without sacrificing necessities, and responsibility, contribution to the climate problem. And we define each of these in terms of this very simply stated development threshold. That is, we define capacity as income on a purchase parity basis to make it comparable across countries, excluding incomes below that threshold of $20 a day. And similarly, we define responsibility as cumulative emissions, excluding subsistence emissions, or emissions that correspond to consumption below that development threshold, based on the argument that that consumption really is going toward meeting basic development needs. So, given capacity and responsibility, and let me say something about why we sort of jump right to capacity and responsibility. The ideas of capacity and responsibility are encoded in the Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, something to which almost all countries are signatories, and which is kind of a legal agreement that this makes sense. One of the key phrases in the very preamble of the Framework Convention says that countries should participate in solving the problem in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And so what does this mean in quantitative terms? What does this meaning of capacity imply? And what we have here are three income distribution charts for three key countries, China, India, and the US. And each of these shows the income of individuals in the country if they were arrayed from poorest on the left to wealthiest on the right. So, to a large degree, this is entirely unsurprising. We see that incomes in India are much less than in China, which are themselves much less than in the US. We see that India, in fact, does have an emerging consuming class of about 80 million people that we often now are hearing about in the media. This burgeoning middle class that's now consuming consumer goods like air conditioners and scooters and larger houses. The Germany inside India, it's sometimes been called, roughly the size of Germany. China has 300 million or so people who are now becoming part of this emerging middle class, this emerging consuming class, roughly the same size as the US. But there the similarity stops. India's consuming class is not at all like Germany's, roughly the same size, but its level of income, its level of consumption, and its level of emissions is much lower than their German counterparts. And similarly with China, the level of income and consumption and emissions they're much lower than their US counterparts. And it's very interesting to hear, even in conversations with negotiators who are intelligent and fairly well-informed people, that this notion of a burgeoning middle class in developing countries has actually grown beyond all bounds of proportion relative to what the empirical data would suggest. The negotiations are, to a surprising extent, being driven by sort of stereotypes of, a booming Shanghainese metropolis that somehow is understood to characterize China's economic development writ across all of China. And one of our main purposes in trying to come up with a simple presentation of what this emerging middle class really looks like and what is their level of consumption, that was one of the main motivations for taking the particular path that we took, to try and bring to the discussion a little bit more of a quantitative and empirical basis for the misapprehensions, really, that are more and more coming into the negotiations. So I won't say anything really about how those calculations were done, save to say that we've made some very standard assumptions that economists make about income distributions. We've used some very standard data sources, and we've taken a very simple step of defining a total indicator of obligation, a responsibility and capacity indicator, in terms of a weighted average of capacity and responsibility. First, I'll say one word about our calculation of responsibility. This is a calculation for a set of key countries. It's actually exactly analogous to what I just showed on the capacity side, except for emissions. The total height of the bar is the total emissions, and the yellow portion, or the light green portion, is the portion that goes toward meeting basic development needs. The green portion is the portion that corresponds to consumption above that development threshold in each of a set of countries. And again, to a large degree, this is unsurprising. We see that the U.S. has, in total, its green bar is bigger than any other country. It has the highest responsibility. We see, for example, countries like Japan and India that have total emissions that are fairly comparable, but a much larger fraction of India's goes toward meeting basic development needs. And so, in our definition, which we claim to be consistent with the idea of safeguarding a right to development, it's only this small fraction corresponding to consumption above the development threshold that would count toward India's responsibility and its calculation of total obligations under a climate framework. So taking this idea of capacity and this idea of responsibility and combining them to by a simple average, arithmetic mean, into a combined indicator of obligation, we get the following. So that column is capacity as a fraction of the global total. This is responsibility as a fraction of the global total. And this is the average of the two. And again, fairly unsurprising. By a measure like this, the U.S. has about 1/3 of the global total of combined capacity and responsibility to deal with the climate problem. The EU has about 1/4. But interestingly, almost all of that is the Western European initial member states, 15 initial member states of the EU, and the relatively poorer new member states. The Central European countries have about 10% of that total. The EU 12, the new member states, have a per capita income that's on average about less than half of that of the Western European countries. Now, interestingly, China has a non-trivial portion of the total capacity and responsibility, about 5%, despite the fact it is much bigger, and in fact its economy is much bigger than Germany, it's the same proportions, still 5%. India, on the other hand, has what truly is a negligible portion of the total global capacity and responsibility. Now, we're very used to hearing about this booming IT industry in India and how there are Indian billionaires even, but it has to be remembered that the vast majority of Indians and even of Chinese are still poor by standards of a reasonable definition of global poverty. And that's what this is meant to try and make clear. So in aggregate, all of the high-income countries, which are about 1/6 of global population, have about 3/4 of the global capacity and responsibility. Whereas the middle-income countries that are about 2/3 of the global population have almost less than 1/4. And the low-income countries, with 21% of the global population, more than 1/5, have a truly negligible amount of capacity and responsibility as defined by these measures. So, in a sense, this is sort of the bottom line, the end of the story. If you want to think about a burden-sharing framework that assigns obligations to countries in a way that's arguably consistent with a right to development defined at a sort of empirically defensible point, this is what you come up with. And it's very hard to jigger numbers by choosing a different but still defensible development threshold that would give you radically different results. Now, one thing that can be said is that this is sort of a static analysis, that this is done looking at the size of economies and the level of emissions now, roughly, actually projected to 2010. But over time, this shift, this allocation will shift. China is growing much more rapidly than the U.S., for example. Even India is growing much more rapidly than the U.S. So looking over time, the same calculation done for 2010, 2020, and 2030 gives the following. This is the same as the last column in the previous slide. And things shift by a non-trivial amount. China, for example, is most striking. China grows from 5% of the global capacity and responsibility, doubling in the next decade, and tripling by 2030. And that is owed to the fact that China's economy, even in fairly conventional projections, this is based on the projections of the International Energy Agency and their World Energy Outlook 2007, shows China possessing a much larger fraction over the next couple decades of the total global capacity and responsibility. The U.S. declined somewhat, from about 1/3 to about 1/4. The EU declined somewhat, from about 1/4 to about 1/5. But this represents, in a very real sense, the almost anxiety that's driving much of the northern negotiating posture, that they're concerned about this rise of China as an emerging superpower and want to see them sort of take their place on the global stage as members of a group of superpowers who are doing their share. So what does one do with this? How does one translate this into something that's useful for a climate regime? And there are sort of two ways of thinking about this. One is sort of in the strict economic sense of these being the shares of money, of financing that different countries contribute to a global pool, a global fund to deal with the climate problem. This is actually, this way of looking at it is what was proposed recently by both the Mexican government in their proposal for a multilateral climate change fund, into which all countries would pay, and from which the costs of the climate transition would be paid. It's also similar to the recent G77 plus China proposal for a large global fund for funding a climate transition. So you could think about these being the shares of each country's obligation to pay into this fund. Now, what would be the costs? What could we expect the cost to be of such a global transition? And the only thing one can say about that is that nobody knows. Here are a number of estimates on both the adaptation side and the mitigation side. And they're pretty much all over the place. But one thing that could be said is that they won't be small. If we're to take seriously the idea of a climate transition, a climate stabilization program that really prevents the worst impacts from happening, it means a major global transition with significant costs. On the adaptation side, many of these are actually only partial estimates for particular sectors or particular types of adaptation, but we could very easily expect it to be on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. On the mitigation side, hundreds of billions. The estimate of the Stern report for stabilizing actually at the 550 ppm level was 1%. He estimated about 2% at the 500 ppm level. The IPCC fourth assessment report estimated it shouldn't be larger than 3% for going all the way down to 445. But for a emissions pathway globally that really stabilizes the climate, that protects the Greenland ice sheet, it can be expected to be even higher than that, perhaps as much as 5%. 5% of the 2020 gross world product would be about $5 trillion a year. So if the U.S. were to pay 2020 about 30% of that, that would be about $150 billion for the U.S. Okay. So that's one way of thinking about how this burden sharing framework could be used. A second way, which is kind of more consistent with what's happened since Kyoto, is a focus on emission targets and what level of emission reduction should countries take. And the way that one could think about that is in terms of the total emission reduction challenge that is before us. And this shows us sort of a BAU projection, again, of the International Energy Agency versus the fairly dramatic reduction pathway that I showed on one of the first slides, that, in quotes, 2-degree pathway. And the area between them is the amount of emission reductions that need somehow to be undertaken. Now, I'll draw attention to this little green sliver. It's based on the estimate of the McKinsey Global Institute of no regrets reduction options, things that really should just be done because they are cost saving. They'd save you more money than they would cost you. The big blue wedge, which is by far the majority of the total amount of mitigation that would need to be done, is somehow what needs to be shared among countries. And if we use the allocation shown in the previous table to break up that wedge into different national reduction commitments, this is what one gets. So the big red wedge here is the U.S.'s portion. That's how much mitigation it will be responsible for in a global burden-sharing system based on something like greenhouse development rights. The purple wedge is the EU's portion. Orange is the rest of the industrialized countries. The blue wedge is China's fairly large and growing mitigation obligation. And it reflects the fact that, yes, China's income is growing significantly, and much of that is above this development threshold. India, actually, is a very small wedge, even out to 2030. And the rest of Annex 1 is the pink. Now, the meaning of this, as far as sort of Kyoto-style reduction commitments, really doesn't become clear until you zoom in on a country and compare this mitigation challenge to a country's own emissions. And we do that first for the U.S. So this is how U.S. emissions are growing over the next few decades, based again on IEA projection, and a small no-regrets wedge that it just should do. And this remaining large obligation, mitigation obligation, is what the U.S. would be committed to do under this type of a burden-sharing framework. And so there are a couple things to note about that. One is that undertaking this much mitigation would actually mean the U.S. emissions would have to be driven negative within a couple decades. Now, there are some technologies that may make that feasible, but it's sort of more sensible, especially from the cost-effectiveness standpoint, to think of this instead as a total global mitigation burden that the U.S. must undertake, some of which is domestic and some of which is international. And we've divided this here into a domestic portion and an international portion based on that same trajectory shown in the first slide, which shows the U.S.'s emissions and all other industrialized country emissions declining to 90% below 1990 levels by mid-century. And even that level of very ambitious domestic reductions leaves a lot more of the U.S.'s obligation to be undertaken, and that's what would be undertaken internationally. So one of the points to make about this slide is that the current discussion about national obligations has barely gone here, especially in the U.S. Obligations and a duty under a climate regime is really thought about in terms of how much we should get our own emissions down. And to a much lower degree has there been any conversation about what the U.S. should do to help enable the transition globally to occur in developing countries as well as industrialized countries. And it's that sort of twofold obligation, a domestic obligation and an international obligation, that fairly urgently needs to become a very prominent part of the domestic discussion and the discussion around the types of legislations that are being considered here, and also the international discussion. On the domestic side, this can be compared to the legislation that's actually being considered now. So these two lines represent the sort of the key legislations being considered, the Lieberman-Warner and the Sanders-Boxer reductions, and also the proposal that, that President-elect Obama just reiterated 1 week ago when he said that he would have a cap-and-trade system put in place that would reduce U.S. emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And the point to make here is that even this, which is somewhat ambitious, that would mean real work domestically, is far short of what would actually be needed in terms of U.S. investment both domestically and especially internationally if we were to truly solve this climate problem. Now, this whole framework is and as we've applied it, equally relevant to developing countries. And we can look at, for example, the implications for India and its growing economy. So again, this is sort of BAU, and based on the International Energy Agency, and a little wedge of no regrets options taken off. And then this dark blue wedge is what India would be responsible for. So that fairly narrow yellow line on an earlier graph that showed India's wedge as a portion of the much larger global mitigation burden, on the scale of India's own emission, implies significant reduction. Now, what's interesting here is that from the standpoint of the negotiations, India and every other developing country has been arguing vehemently against being forced to take legally binding reduction commitments, seeing emission targets. However, at the same time, India, China, South Africa, South Korea have been taking very interesting mitigation steps within their own countries outside of the climate regime. China's fuel economy standards are higher than the U.S.'s fuel economy standards. India is about to invest millions of dollars into building up a solar industry. South Korea is actually about to announce an emissions target for itself. South Africa has announced its own decline in emission path that it will stick to. Countries are actually taking steps, but they're reacting very strongly right now in this phase to the idea of having legally binding emission reduction commitments imposed upon them. The implications are more dramatic for China. China's business as usual emissions relative to the emission reductions it would be required to take it's actually fairly dramatic local action. Initially, it's fairly small, and this actually is entirely consistent with the types of steps that China is putting in place already. Its energy efficiency, energy intensity target that it announced and actually now seems like it's likely to actually meet. And over time, as China's income and technological resources expand, its mitigation obligation would expand, but it would still be the host of a fair amount of technological and financial support to enable it to transition to a trajectory that's actually consistent with that 2-degree target. And in the developing countries as a whole, most of the reductions that would be needed to remain consistent with stabilizing the climate would actually be facilitated by countries of the North. So I'll close it here with some final comments to underscore some of the main points. The first is that the scientific evidence truly is bracing, that the fourth assessment report of the IPCC released a year ago, but even science that's come out since then, is truly alarming, that what's happened in terms of the beginning of release of methane from the Siberian continental shelf and from the Siberian permafrost, what's happening with the large ice sheets is truly alarming. And that reality, that scientific reality, to be honest, has not yet been internalized into the climate negotiations. And the lesson from that science is that carbon-based growth is simply no longer an option, neither in the North nor in the South. And that has to somehow be accommodated by a burden-sharing framework within a climate regime if the climate regime is truly meant to stabilize the climate. Now, what that means is that rigorous binding commitments to domestic emissions in the North are only part of the story. That rigorous binding commitments, which is only starting to be taught, actually hasn't even really been talked about in the climate negotiations, rigorous binding commitments to North to South flows of finance and technology and capacity building have to also be part of the story. In fact, are at least half of the story. That there have to be, in addition to the ambitious domestic reductions in the North, also ambitious and earnest investment in North to South financial and technological cooperation. Now, in principle, a corresponding commitment from this consuming class in the South would also be necessary. The scale of transfer is large enough that it would be very difficult to mobilize the North to actually accept this obligation if people in the North didn't also see their Southern counterparts, those who are truly living a middle-class lifestyle, also do their share of the global burden. In practice, I think this is necessary, but what will be needed first is a stage that is focused on truly building trust. Since 1992 and the Rio Convention and the UNFCCC adoption, and through 97 and the Kyoto Protocol, and since then, there has been an expectation that the North, the industrialized countries, should take the lead. And to be perfectly honest, the South is still waiting for that to happen. The South is still waiting for that to happen in terms of ambitious domestic reductions in the North, and also in terms of the North starting to provide resources for adaptation, as the impacts of climate change are starting to be more and more felt, and resources for the technological transition that needs to happen. And a Copenhagen phase, an agreement in Copenhagen, will need to focus on the North taking the lead. Now that means the domestic reductions, that means investment in finance and technology transfer. It also means a much more serious engagement and cooperation between the North and the South on the types of measures that would need to be put in place in order to actually see a transition starting to happen in the South. There's sort of trust building that needs to happen on both sides. The alternative to something like this kind of a burden-sharing framework, something like this type of an allocation of the effort, is likely to be a weak regime where there isn't really that great a chance of bending the curve of emissions and putting us onto a trajectory that could truly prevent what threatens to be a climate catastrophe. And that statement is not really a statement just about sort of the desire to have a system that's equitable and just. It's really about the politics. It's really about political reality. And this is a problem where recognizing a right to develop it in the South and defining and building a climate regime that acknowledges that and allocates the burden among countries that sort of codifies that right to develop in the South is politically necessary. That the countries of the South who are dealing with what really is a development crisis as well will not put resources into a climate stabilization regime if they don't see it being defined in a way and having the burden allocated in a way that also preserves their right to development and allows them to expand energy services and invest resources in meeting their development needs. Okay, I'll close it there. I'll just make the comment that there's a much more expanded version of this work that has a lot of the technical detail and also political background that will be released in time for the post-non negotiations in another couple of weeks, released online. And it also has sort of an updated analysis and a database and an online tool that allows you to kind of fiddle with the analysis and look at the implications of, say, different development thresholds or different weightings of capacity and responsibility, or even different levels of strenuousness of the climate regime itself. I'll leave it at that and pass it over to you, Darrel, to make some comments.
Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Well, first, let me just thank the organizers of this lecture series. I think it's been a terrific lecture series. I've learned a lot from it, and I also want to thank them for inviting me to comment on Sivan's very interesting and important presentation. And I want to thank Sivan also for the presentation and his co-authors for the work that they're doing. The work, I think, is tremendously important, and I commend this booklet to you. I think it's a very good account of a real dilemma that we face and an important, serious attempt to try to work through it. I want to say just a few comments about it, maybe 4 or so comments. I'll of necessity be brief here. The first thing that I want to mention is that I think one of the attractive features about the account that they're developing is that it takes seriously differential capacities and responsibilities of persons within countries. And this is something that, as Sivan noted, is something that hasn't received a lot of attention, but it is the case, of course, that not everybody in the developing world is poor. And there is an increasing number of well-to-do people in the developing world, and they try to account for this in their account of responsibility within this framework. And they do this in 2 ways, as far as I understand it. One is by ensuring that there's a certain group of people who are simply exempt from responsibilities. These are the people below the $20 a day or $16 a day threshold. Is it 20 or 16? 20, I guess it is. 20, yeah. Right. Below this $20 a day threshold, they're simply exempt from responsibilities, but people above that threshold then get assigned a responsibility. So there's this idea that they want to individualize the right to development by ensuring that everybody who falls below that threshold simply isn't assigned any responsibilities at all, but people above that threshold are assigned responsibilities, even if they happen to be living in a very poor country. Now, I think that that's very important, and I think it's very important for 2 reasons. One reason why it's important is a moral reason. The moral reason is that it just seems, intuitively, it seems to be unjust to assign somebody a lighter burden of responsibility simply because they happen to be living around a bunch of people whose responsibilities are lighter. Right? It shouldn't be, the responsibility that a person has shouldn't be a function of who they happen to live around, but it should be a function of certain features of that person. How much money they make, for example, what their carbon emissions are. So the account tries to be sensitive to that moral concern. Call that moral individualism. That is, that the entitlements or the obligations of persons are a function of the persons themselves and not a function of the group that they belong to. If you globalize that notion of moral individualism, you get a kind of moral cosmopolitanism. That is, that the entitlements of persons are what matter, not the entitlements of the groups that they belong to. There's a second reason that I think that that's an important perspective, and that's the political perspective that you heard Sivan refer to at the end of his talk. The negotiators of the industrialized countries, of course, are well aware of the fact that there are wealthy people in China, that there are some wealthy people in India. And they're going to be sure that when it comes to assigning burdens to people in the climate change negotiations, that it's not the case that people just get off the hook simply because they happen to live in China or in India. And this tries to take account of that and make for a proposal that I think will be more palatable to develop to negotiators who are living in or who are representing industrialized countries. But now let me say a few concerns that I have about the way in which they try to model this, and I'll mention three. The first is that the moral individualism of the proposal is an individualism in theory. What do I mean by that? Well, although there's going to be a differential assignment to countries on the basis of differences in income and responsibility within those countries, there's no guarantee at all in the proposal that what states will do with that will result in differential assignments within the states. So there's no guarantee that within a state, for example, what the state does is ensure that the people below this $20 a day threshold aren't held accountable for their emissions. There's no insurance for that whatsoever. Now, you might say, well, that's sort of the nature of the project, because what the project is a matter of coming to an agreement in an international forum, and we have representatives of states bargaining here, and we can't hold states accountable for what they do internally. Certainly, that's part of the feature of the situation, but of course, there is a precedent for tying domestic policy to international agreements. We have domestic requirements under the WTO framework, for example. States are required to do certain things within the WTO framework. So we might think that under a framework like this, there ought to be some insurance that states actually assign the responsibilities in a progressive fashion. That might be an amendment to the proposal that's worth thinking about. Okay, two other thoughts about this. Even this, in theory, moral individualism of the proposal, however, I think has or is compromised in an important sort of way. The notion of capacity that gets assigned to various states is not disaggregated. So if you think about the slide that Sivan showed us, and you think about China's green triangle, which was relatively small compared to the United States' green triangle, and you say, well, the responsibility of China is a function, as I understand it, of the area of that triangle, right? The responsibility of the United States is a function of the area of the United States triangle. So there's greater aggregate, the capacity. I'm talking about capacity, not responsibility for the moment. There's greater aggregate capacity in the United States. There's more wealth in the United States than there is in China. The problem with looking at it that way without disaggregating it is that there's the possibility that there's a wealthy person in that triangle in China that's higher along the vertical axis than, say, a lower middle class person in the United States, not as high along that vertical axis. So that the person in China will get a bill for capacity that's lower than the bill that the person in the United States will get for capacity, even though the person in China is much wealthier than the person in the United States. Why? Well, because the capacity index itself is not disaggregated. That makes for the possibility of there being actually regressive transfers between states. Now, that I think takes away from some of what looks to be some of the morally attractive features of the proposal. It also, I think, takes away from some of the politically attractive features of the proposal, because you can be sure that negotiators in the United States and in other developing countries are going to be aware of this, and they're going to press this point. They're going to say, why should our lower middle class people pay more than a rich person in China for the capacity portion of the bill? Final point I'll make is a similar point about responsibility. Again, responsibility isn't disaggregated in this proposal. So you look at responsibility in terms of the historic responsibility of countries. Now, even if I happen to emit less in my daily living than, say, a well-to-do person in China, I'm going to be hit with a higher bill due to responsibility than the person living in China is. That's a function of the historic responsibility of my country versus the historic responsibility of that person's country. Now, I think that there's more of a point of assigning responsibility this way than there is a point of assigning capacity in the way that they do, because you might say, well, there's some sense in which citizens ought to be held responsible for the conduct of their countries. But whatever sense that is, I think if we agree that there is some sense in which citizens of countries ought to be held responsible for the conduct of their countries, it's also important to realize that it takes away a bit from the attractiveness of the proposal, which is a proposal that's supposed to be sensitive to the differences in capacities and responsibilities within countries. Insofar as we don't disaggregate responsibility, again, we lose some of the attractiveness of the proposal. So three concerns that I have about the proposal. One is that the proposal seems to be individualistic in theory only. There's no guarantee that states will actually assign the responsibilities in a progressive fashion within the confines of their domestic policy. The second is that the way in which states, the way in which capacity gets assigned to states is insensitive to, or doesn't disaggregate the responsibility within, the capacity within states. And third, that the idea of responsibility is a national idea of responsibility that, again, is not disaggregated to individuals. All three of these take away from some of what I take to be what's morally attractive about the proposal. Now, having said, having raised these concerns, I don't want to leave you with the thought that I think it's somehow not an attractive proposal. I think it's actually a very attractive proposal. I think part of the reason why it's attractive is because it's hard to see what else might work in the context that we're facing, given that we've delayed so long coming up with a proposal to actually make the kinds of reductions that are necessary. And it's for that reason, among others, that I think the authors should be commended for the work that they've done.
We have considerable time for some questions. Perhaps students can come forward too, so both of you can have those questions. Might indicate to whom they are directed. Do we have a moving mic? We do. Okay, so raise your hand and we'll get the moving mic to you. Right over there. No, we want to have it on the record.
Hello? Okay. So I'm Bob Kopp. I'm a postdoc in the STEP and Geosciences program here. My question, if you're framing this in terms of a right to development, does this framework then subsume all other development activities? I mean, is there a need for wealth transfers outside this framework if you set it up this way?
Should we take a few questions and then come back to them?
Okay, that's a good idea. Why don't we have 2 or 3 questions together?
I'm Jo Evans at the Woodrow Wilson School at the moment. I guess the one thing that strikes me is I think the way that preamble to the UNFCCC is normally interpreted is more around recognising the different economic capacity of countries to act. And it's not clear to me how your framework takes into account the way that the different levels of obligation would in fact have quite a different level of cost in terms of achieving them in each of the individual countries to whom you're assigning the burden. So if you could sort of elaborate on that a little bit would be great.
I'm Peter Singer from the Centre for Human Values. I just want to know how you chose the 1990 base for where you were counting emissions from, or whether there was any... I mean, obviously we have 1990, we've negotiated as the base for where we're talking about emissions relative to, but that doesn't seem to me to give the reason why we should start there. I've suggested we might start from 1992 as the date when all of the nations signed on to the Rio Earth Summit Declaration, which committed them to not causing dangerous anthropogenic climate change. So from that point, you actually have a kind of a moral commitment that they've made and signed on to, which would be a reason for arguing that that's a valid base. Alternatively, of course, you could go back to the Industrial Revolution, which would produce very interestingly different results, I imagine.
Should I take those? Sorry. Thank you all. With regard to sort of a right to development, something that I should point out and sort of confess is that we've framed this in terms of the fairly high-minded notion of preserving a right to development within the climate regime. But when it comes down to it, we've taken a very minimalist approach. We've basically tried to define a climate regime that does not, the costs of which do not undermine the right to development. We've taken what really can't be claimed to be anything more than sort of a Hippocratic approach. First, do no harm. We haven't tried to make any effort to create within the climate regime mechanisms by which this population of people below the development threshold would be raised to the development threshold. We've still left that among countries to deal with as they would. And the reason, of course, for that is not that we're not sympathetic to much more robust international efforts to raise people to a decent standard of living, but because we don't think that a climate regime itself could be encumbered by those demands and still survive. It's already a difficult enough thing to try and negotiate. So, Bob, I think the answer to the question is that we haven't made any effort to sort of link or subsume other international efforts into a right to development is trying to be codified. One thing that is worth saying is that adaptation itself, which this framework would attempt to sort of identify a burden-sharing framework for sharing the costs of, is itself very pro-development. To first order, adaptation activities, enhancing food security or disaster management or reducing infant mortality or increasing life expectancies are building resilience is basically a development effort. With regard to the question of trying to ensure that the costs of the burdens are consistent with a country's capabilities, as it's defined in the Framework Convention, I would say that to first order we've managed to do that. We've managed to define obligations in a way that the, say, tons of reduction or dollar contribution to a global fund is consistent with a country's capability as we've defined it in a way that we think is consistent with the right to development. Now, there is the sort of more technocratical issue of whether a given ton of reduction in a given country is much more costly than in another country. And that would need to be dealt with. But I think the first order we have kind of reflected what the definition of capability that the UNFCCC really does try to embrace. But if you don't think so, I'd like to hear more about why you think that wouldn't be the case. And then the one other question, Peter, on 1990, you've pointed out something very important, that we've developed sort of two complementary things. One is sort of a burden-sharing framework, a set of principles for trying to encode a right to development within the climate regime. And then the second is an indicative quantification of how those principles could be translated into actual quantified burdens. And in doing so, we've made some choices. We've made some choices about things like where exactly that development threshold should be set and what would be the appropriate start year for the definition of responsibility. And when it comes down to it, we've actually, and in fact somewhat intentionally, made an effort to identify numbers that, on balance, show that even very generous assumptions to the North give the North the much more of the share of the burden than is being talked about within other burden-sharing frameworks. A development threshold higher than $7,500, than $20 a day, would be very easy to justify. Very easy to justify on the basis of continued contributions of income growth to welfare, even above $20 a day. Start date of before 1990 actually is one of the main responses that many of the developing country delegates, but even some people in the industrialized countries, have come back to us with. Why are we just defining the polluter pays principle in terms of when we had a legal responsibility, when there is actually already encoded in U.S. national law, for example, in the Superfund law, and also some international law, the idea of responsibility, even if it wasn't responsibility for impacts that were in violation of some kind of international agreement. So some have said, at least say 1968, when Johnson had his first panel of people explaining climate change to him and warning him about the dangers, or even 1850 in the dawn of the Industrial Revolution when significant emissions started. So there's definitely a debate to be had about the particular start year. Going back further in time obviously only shifts more of the burden to the north. And then finally, Darrel, on the issue of sort of the extent to which a regime like this that's really focused on how a right to development is defined at an individual level, but then assigns national obligations. You're right. We're bound by the constraints of negotiations in a multilateral environmental agreement, which is multilateral environmental agreements are particularly wary about imposing of any sort of obligations that would undermine sovereignty. Now, but I think it would be very interesting to see if over time nations become willing to subordinate in certain ways sovereignty to an international agreement, as they do now with trade, as you pointed out, just as the severity of the problem becomes more important. But one thing that's worth pointing out is that if that's a moral argument, that the moral value of this kind of an approach and this kind of an embodying of a right to development into a climate change regime, if the argument is that, well, developing countries may still impose the obligations and sort of tax people in a more regressive way than was implied by the assigning on a national level of obligations, then the response from those who are making that moral argument in the North would be to lessen the obligations on developing countries, so that less of that pressure, there's less of a pressure to devolve responsibilities to the poorer people. So it's a little bit perverse to make that moral claim and then to say, therefore, a climate regime shouldn't acknowledge a right to development in the assignment of national obligations and therefore put greater obligations on the South. I'll stop there and we'll go on for some more time.
So maybe just a quick point about I think it was the second question about different ways to understand what differentiating capacity and responsibility mean. I think some people do understand it as saying that, well, what we want to do is equalize the burden. And that means that there's going to be very different costs for different countries, but it's going to be kind of an equal marginal disutility, you could say. I think the implicit argument of this view, and I don't want to assign a position to the authors of the view that's not actually theirs, but I think the implicit argument of this view is that that's just not consistent with the right to development. That if you start trying to equalize the burden, you're going to be equalize the marginal disutility. And equalize the burden to the various states, you're going to be assigning too great of a responsibility to states that simply can't cope with that kind of responsibility and still develop their economy. That's at least what I take the author's position to be.
This is no doubt a very naive question, Sivan. Is the mic on? And I apologize. It's related to your last remarks about sovereignty, and I apologize if I missed if you commented on this earlier. You mentioned the issues of sovereignty. Well, I can easily imagine that the wisdom you presented would be acceptable to people like the people in this room in every country on this planet. But the governments of many countries in the North won't even give up the right to invade and subjugate other people. So what makes us think that and we know some of these governments ourselves, what makes us think that they would voluntarily give resources to other countries which would allow them to catch up, et cetera, et cetera?
I'll take that because as it is. Good to see you, Darrel. I think that this is one example of a whole set of questions that are worrisome, if not depressing, because they point out that we're, as far as politics as usual, we are so far from where we need to be. Whether it has to do with concessions regarding sovereignty or just with regard to solving this problem and doing what needs to be done. And I think that what the science has made increasingly clear is that what's necessary from the scientific standpoint, what it will take to solve the climate problem, is so far beyond even the farthest reaches of what can be considered politically realistic today, that we're left with three options. Either we just won't solve the problem, or the science will somehow change and we'll get a lot of good news, which is very unlikely, or more likely that what's considered politically realistic will change. And what's considered politically realistic really is, despite sort of how oppressively inertial things seem now, political realism is a remarkably labile thing. And we saw a month ago or so the U.S. Congress suddenly mobilizing $700 billion, which is more than 1% of gross world product now, for a bailout that was very unclear. The intention of in fact, and what we've seen is a radical redesign of the bailout itself. And so it's interesting to see that things can happen that quickly. There are other, obviously other examples of that too. Like on September 11th, political reality was radically defined in the U.S., and we became willing to, if not obsessed with, things that we wouldn't have the week before. And so I think that ultimately what will be needed to solve this problem really is a shift in what's politically realistic. And I think part of that will come from, the type of education campaigns like Climate Central that folks here are key members of. And also, loath to say it, but more very striking, severe impacts like another Katrina or two, or Australian drought, or the types of impacts that are happening in the Arctic. So I think right now all we can do is sort of cross our fingers and work hard to try and redefine what's politically realistic. But the challenges are truly daunting, no question about that.
I'm Prashant from System Biology at the Institute for Advanced Study. I hesitate a little to ask this question, and you may already have said all you have to say about this in relation to the previous question. So you convincingly showed us how urgent it is to take concerted action, but no matter which proposal is going to be adopted, a key feature of that is going to be building this trust, as you pointed out. And if human history is any indication, that seems to be an insurmountable problem. So I was wondering if you have any ideas about what one might do about that specific aspect of trust building, because it seems to solve a lot of our problems, including climate change.
I think part of the solution is within the climate regime itself. And countries of the North actually showing, really for the first time since 1992 and the Framework Convention was signed, that they're serious about this problem and that they're willing to truly, in quotes, take the lead, which is the language of the Framework Convention, and start to solve the problem. But part of it, I think, will have to also happen outside of the climate regime. That obviously the distrust that exists extends far beyond the climate regime, and that while negotiations within the climate regime, for example, are fairly fraught. I think there really is a sense that there are parties who are not negotiating in good faith. That's as true of other international negotiations like the trade regime. So I think, again, massive challenge. I think that the steps that will need to be taken have to happen across a range of realms. But one thing that could be said is that something that we have going for us is that building that trust will not necessarily be a matter merely of industrialized countries taking sort of deciding to take a moral stance and doing what's right from the standpoint of the South. It's a recognition, sort of it's an issue of enlightened self-interest and the recognition that the only way to solve this problem is via a truly cooperative regime where more trust is built, and then the ambitious steps are taken that need to be taken. So I think in a sense, we're lucky in that this is a problem, a challenge that's truly civilizational in its scope and threatening on that scale, and that for the North to take seriously the idea of a right to development in the South is now an issue of also survival in the North, and preservation of an ecosystem on which it depends for its own prosperity. So that's different than other environmental problems like water resources in the South, where the North really can kind of turn a blind eye to that.
May I? Andrew Isle, master's student at the Woodrow Wilson School. I'd like to follow up on your comments about political reality and the fact that that's a very, or at least a potentially moving target. Given that at this point it's unlikely that the major players at the negotiating table in climate change negotiations would be willing to make the economic sacrifices, the sovereignty sacrifices, and the voluntary transfer of resources to other countries to the degree that would be necessary to attain this goal in a little over a year. Given that likely scenario, how would you envision possibly designing a climate agreement to allow for the ratcheting up of commitments? And two levers that struck me are the two very arbitrary levels of the development threshold at $7,500 a year, and also the 2-degree threshold, which is also widely used but a completely arbitrary target. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Why don't you wait for the last question, or we'll take both of them next to each other.
Helen Hunt from the community. I don't know whether I'm a skeptic or not, all right? But I do have a basic general question, possibly of an ethical nature. In fact, I think it is of an ethical nature. You began your talk proclaiming that we now have an emergency, that there's more and more evidence it's in the alarm state. We really have to respond to this. Now, there are tremendous gaps in information and data. I mean, this is public knowledge, or it's available publicly. The information that you get out of your computer models is only as good as the inputs, and there are tremendous gaps. All right. So, what is your basis, or at least your ethical basis, for proclaiming this to be an emergency? It's really alarming.
Yeah. Two observations by way of a question. The first is that the idea of scaring policymakers into rationality has been tried before and found wanting, right? The second is that this is still a state-based framework, right? The right to development that you've posed, it's the right to development, and the mediating institutions are states. And the failure of states, both in the North and the South, to grapple with this problem is in part the problem. Right? The pattern of development and the failure to develop in some ways in the South. And so it seems to me that, one of the challenges that we struggle with is that you've put the weight of responsibility on exactly that set of mechanisms that have actually created a key element of this problem. And it's not clear to me that, I mean, I agree with everything that you say on these questions, as you know, but I'm just wrestling with this as a dilemma, that this is a very crooked reed, timber, whatever you want to call it. It's a broken machine that produces bad things on this question. And it's not clear to me that this is actually the right way to go, that when you talk about it in civilizational terms, individual terms, that you've really left no space for the non-state process. And I'm just wondering whether in terms of that, you might want to say a few things.
So those will be the last questions. So each of you, why don't you go first and you can have a sum up. Well, I actually, I don't know that I have anything in particular to say to those questions. I have one thing I might say, though, if we have a moment. I think Sivan's right to say that there's an element of political realism that's important to this proposal, and it's one of the attractive features of it that I pointed out. But I also think that it's possible to rest too much on that kind of an argument when it comes to these sorts of things, because it's simply also, I think, realistic to consider that the states of the North are going to be probably less impacted by climate change, and the burdens, if it gets presented to them simply in terms of a matter of self-interest, they might say, well, you know, we actually have greater capacity to adapt. So to hell with a mitigation regime that's going to put a lot of costs on us. We're just going to go our own way, and we're going to adapt individually as states and not worry about a multilateral agreement at all. So I think if we want to if we want to go in this direction, and I think we do want to go in this direction, I think we have to put a lot of weight on the moral arguments. We can't put too much emphasis on these concerns of rationality and political realism.
Okay. Yeah, that image is taken by a group who is responsible for a project in Bangladesh. They're funded by Christian Aid, which is one of our supporters. Help with poverty programs in Bangladesh. And what she's doing is she's recoiling a motor. They didn't say anything about whether the motor is ultimately powered by renewable energy or good old fossil energy. So that's our PR friend Surgina. With regard to the question about the climate science itself, I think you're absolutely right to draw attention to the uncertainties. I think that the uncertainties and the big gaps in the models and the big gaps in our understanding are very real and shouldn't be dismissed. But I also think that it's very important to recognize that uncertainty cuts both ways. Things could be better than these stories would suggest, but things could also be much worse. And in such a world, I think the only sensible thing is to take an insurance-type approach, a risk management type approach, where you take seriously the prospects for very, very severe damage, and you do what's necessary in order to avert those damages. Otherwise, if you simply wait for incontrovertible evidence, it will be too late, and our response will no longer be available to us. The only response will be fairly frenetic, partial, and extremely expensive adaptation. And then Zia, wonderful points. Policymakers can't be scared into action. Something we did about a month ago was we had some meetings, sort of focus groups, with a whole set of different, 2 different meetings with Washington NGOs. The main groups who are very involved in lobbying on Capitol Hill and all. And one of the things that they said was that they absolutely have so far been scared to go here. They haven't been talking about the extent of industrialized countries' international obligations, and that they realize that not only do they need to do that, and need to do this on the timescale between here and Copenhagen, but that it may well have been a mistake not to have started this groundwork earlier, because building public support for the idea of of a truly international cooperative response is something that they've dropped the ball on. And one of the things they did was they helped us try and start to craft a narrative, which is where this is not about scaring American policymakers into doing what's absolutely crucially needed to avert a disaster, but to start framing it in terms of a recovery of American leadership and gaining respect internationally. And that story goes much, much better, flies much, much better on Capitol Hill. Although that course is almost exactly opposed to the course suggested by your second point, which we just sort of bypass nations altogether. And hadn't mentioned so far, but my second project, other than this, is starting to ramp up some armed revolt so that we could really do what's needed to no, that's not actually true. That's not actually true. Climate transition by any means necessary. Right? No, I think that in part, Zia, you're right, that ultimately the real transition that's implied here, fundamental transition where there's a radical restructuring of the energy sector, but in a way that honors a local right to development, involves a future that's remarkably different than today's. It's not solely a technological solution. It involves thinking about lifestyles, it involves thinking about consumption patterns, it involves thinking about our relationship to the poor majority of the world. Like, for example, the fact that, like, you know, in a framework like this, we're talking about putting the obligations to deal with this problem on what amounts to a minority of the world. It's about a third of the world's population that lies above the development threshold. They also have about 85% of the world's resources. And starting to think about a world in which those resources really were thought of as resources that need in part to be allocated to solving global problems and dealing with poverty, it's hard to imagine a solution where that's not part of the answer. And that answer definitely goes beyond sort of very statist perspective on how these problems are dealt with. So that's not much of an answer. The armed revolt part of the answer is probably the most convincing part of it, but there's little more that can be said in detail since it's such a fundamental transition. I don't really know how to go about it.
Yeah.